Hello, does this work? Everybody can hear all right? Good. Okay. Okay. I am Tom Campbell. It's my pleasure to be here today. Having been part of the creation that was to become the Monroe Institute, I take particular pleasure in seeing how far it has come, how much it has grown, and how many lives it has enriched along the way. The theme of the 22nd Professional Seminar is Consciousness, the Endless Frontier. As one of the original explorers who has never stopped exploring, I am particularly pleased to have been asked to kick off this 22nd Professional Seminar. We're here because of our association with TMI and because of our interest in creative and useful applications of Hemi-Sync. So I will give you a short description of the genesis of both Hemi-Sync and TMI. Secondly, in consonance with the theme, Consciousness, the Endless Frontier, I will explain very quickly the core of what I have come to understand about the nature of consciousness and reality. Okay. Please hold your questions until the end. There's never enough time for questions, and I'm likely to take the lion's share of the 2 hours allotted to me. But I'm going to be here all day today, tomorrow, the next day, as long as most of you will be here. And I'm very open to have meetings. Whether it's early in the morning or late at night is fine with me, as long as it's fine with Shirley and it doesn't interrupt with any of the things that are already scheduled for the seminar. So I think we'll have to hold most of the questions until later today or the next several days. This is going to be a very quick skim over the top. Actually, it's more like a hop, skip, and a jump across the very top of this. Actually, this was a very hard presentation to generate. And not because I had a hard time figuring out what to say, but because I had a very hard time figuring out what not to say and still say within the 2-hour time limit. That was the challenge. Now, these slides are going to be busy. They're probably going to have more words on them than you can read. I'm going to go through them very quickly. I'm going to be speaking very quickly so that I can won't have Shirley mad at me for going over my time. I understand a big hook comes out from somewhere around here if you go past your time. So I'm motivated to get done. So it is going to be quick. All of these slides are going to be available on my website. You see that, www.mybigtoe.com. So you don't have to copy a lot of things down. You can find the slides. I haven't put up there yet, but I will just as soon as I get a chance to get on the internet. Also, the slides are on the computer here, so I'm sure TMI will pass them out to you if you have a thumb drive or some way to pick them up. So if the slides become a problem for you, trying to read them and listen, stop reading and just listen. Okay? I will say everything that you need to hear. You just let the slides go. They become annoying for you. Okay, first, a little introduction. Now and always a scientist sums it up pretty well. In college, I majored in both physics and mathematics, went on to grad school, finally did thesis work in experimental nuclear, and now I work for NASA. I do risk analysis, which basically means physics models, system behavior, complex system behavior. So the team that I work on, and it's a fairly large team, what we do is try to discover what could possibly go wrong, what the probability is of it going wrong, and then if it does go wrong, how do you fix it? Okay, well, how did a physicist like me end up, exploring consciousness and being part of the Explorer program early on? Well, once I left graduate school, I took a job, and my first boss, Bill Yost, introduced me to Bob Monroe's first book. Well, at that time, this is 1972, early in 72. At that time, it was his only book. And the boss comes out and he hands me the book and says, "Tom, I want you to read this and tell me what you think." So I did. I read it, and a few weeks later, he asked me, "Well, what about this book?" And I said, "Well, there's 3 possibilities. 1, this guy has a good imagination and is just trying to sell books. 2, this guy's nuts. 3, this guy's sane, honest, and accurate, and there's a whole lot of reality out there that I would love to experience and understand. But how do you know? Unless you meet him and can get a measure of the man, how do you know? Is this guy nuts or what? Well, my boss and I both kind of shrugged shoulders and agreed that, it was just really impossible to know from reading the book. But evidently Bill was listening. And about 3 months later, he came by and said, "Hey, Tom, we've located Bob Monroe. He doesn't live that far away. There's a bunch of us going to go out and visit him. Would you like to come?" And I said, "Absolutely, I want to come. I want to know whether it's 1, 2, or 3. I want to meet this guy." Well, that was, like I say, that was more like the spring of '72. And toward the end of that meeting, we did meet with Bob, and we spent the whole evening with him. He was very gracious as usual. And I found out, of course, that it wasn't 1 or it wasn't 2, that Bob was very real. He was very genuine. He didn't have anything to sell. He just wanted to understand what was going on, and he wanted to put it into scientific terms so that he could share it with other people. That was his ambition. And we found out why it is he invited all of us and put up with us for a whole evening. Toward the end of the night, we were on the back deck of what was called the lab. There wasn't a whole lot in it at that point yet, but with Bob, it was one of those things like, build it and they will come. He had built it, and he wasn't quite sure, I don't think, what he was going to do with it at that point. But he looked at all of us, and he kind of scanned us over, and he said, "Well, you guys are all scientists and engineers, right?" And we all kind of looked at each other like, "What's coming next?" And we nodded our heads, yeah. And he says, "Well, would any of you like to join me here and work in this lab and help instrument it and put it together and study consciousness?" Well, it took me about a millisecond for my hand to go in the air. And I said, "Absolutely, I'd love to do that, Bob, but I'll do it if you teach me what you know." And he kind of considered that for about another half a second after that. Another hand went up in the air, and it was Dennis Menerick. Now you have to understand, Dennis and I were both in our 20s. We were middle to late 20s at this time. And Dennis said, "I'd like to do it too, but I want you to teach me what you know." So Bob kind of looked around the rest of the group. I think he really was hoping somebody with a little more stature and experience and reputation, would take him up on it instead of 2 kids, not that far out of graduate school. But nobody else said anything at all, so it was a deal. And about 3 weeks later, Dennis and I are coming out to Whistlefield Farm. We're meeting with Bob, and from then on, we'd meet with Bob like Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays. We'd get there after dinner, about 7:30. We'd go to the lab, and we'd start building equipment. There really wasn't a whole lot there. There wasn't any measurement devices for the people. There was just audio in the 3 booths. So we would build equipment and start figuring out what we were going to do next, experiments and things that we could do at the lab. After about an hour or so, Bob would come up, and then Dennis and I would get in the booths. There were 3 booths, and Bob would begin to carry out his part of the bargain, which is to teach us what it is. We knew there really wasn't a program then. I don't even know that Focus 10 existed then. It may have, but certainly nothing beyond that. So, Bob was just making it up as he went, and we were just making it up as we went, all trying to come up with something that would make science out of this. That was our goal. Well, we did this for years. Dennis and I were coming out here probably for pretty much straight 5 years or so. We were coming out 3 days a week, and we'd come out on weekends. So you can imagine that we were averaging somewhere between 20 and 30 hours a week, with the lab and with Bob. So, 20 hours a week with Bob Monroe as your personal trainer, you couldn't help but learn something, and learn something pretty quickly. So it wasn't that long before Dennis and I had pretty well mastered the altered states. We were going out of body. We were making non-physical friends and people that we could get information from. We were doing experiments. Everything had to be experimental. There wasn't any point in doing anything you couldn't check to see whether it was real or not. So that was the kind of the ground rule. It wasn't just fun and games and have a neat experience. It was, is this real? And it took a while before, it probably took 1.5 years or so before I got to the point that I could answer that question with a yes. And that's, everyone has to come to that point somewhere where you decide, is this real or am I making this up? But in any case, Dennis and I were in cut and try mode, and we were doing anything that we could. We ourselves had become very sensitive instruments to altered states of consciousness. Bob drilled us going, down to that pulsation state, out of body and back up and back down and so on. We did that thousands of times, so we'd be very sensitive to the altered states and the pathway in between them. That was the first part of our training. So Dennis and I were very sensitive to our consciousness and what state it was in at that time. So we'd do things, we crawled in pyramids, aluminum pyramids, because a book was out that said, inside a pyramid oriented with you could get different, altered states. Everything that was ever published, we tried to read on the subject. So we'd go into pyramids and see what it did to us because we were very sensitive. I stuck my head between two big capacitor plates with a couple 100,000 volts on them to see whether or not we could oscillate the pineal gland, because we had read back in the Muldoon and Carrickton days that they thought it had to do with the pineal gland, and we thought, well, and we knew it had to do with 4 hertz because Bob, and we did too, when we got in that pulsation state, you'd get this around 4 hertz vibration going on. So we knew that was physical, because once we outfitted the lab with GSR, we could actually see that little GSR meter sit there and oscillate at 4 hertz. So it wasn't just a perception of consciousness. There was something physiological going on that was oscillating at 4 hertz. So those were our only keys. So we were cutting and trying everything. Dennis went to visit some faith healers from the Dominican Republic and see what he did. And each time we were using our body as the instrument and our mind as the instrument of how did it affect our consciousness, looking for tools. Okay, well that went on for a year or so, and we were unsuccessful in finding appropriate tools. And one day while I was at work, and Dennis and I worked at the same place, Dennis came by, he gave me some papers and said, take a look at this, maybe we can use it out at the lab. So I looked at it, and it was an article by Oster about binaural beats. And in that article it mentioned that it was thought that binaural beats might entrain EEG, might entrain brain waves. So that sounded pretty interesting. So we thought, yeah, well, let's give it a try. I mean, we were trying everything. And unfortunately, the very few days after that, Dennis had to leave the country with his job, took him out of the country for about a month. And when he came back, he went to the EE lab. He was a EE. And went to the EE lab at University of Virginia, borrowed some equipment, made a binaural beat tape. It was a very nicely done tape. He started out at alpha and went down, or started out at alpha, stepped down, small steps at a time, down to the theta region at the 4 hertz, stayed there for an hour or two and stepped back up. And we vowed we'd go out to the lab our first opportunity. Well, it was good timing, actually. Bob was out of town. He was out of town for 2 weeks, so that gave us lots of time to play in the lab. And because we would rather be in the bed being instructed by Bob than we would be actually doing research on our own. So this gave us time to play around, and we went out, we put that binaural beat tape on, and we listened to it, and there it just stepped us down. We followed it. We didn't try to do anything with it, just listen. And we could tell from our consciousness, it would just drop us, and we could tell when that would go down 1 hertz, it would drop. We could feel every step of the way. It was like walking down a pair of steps. Then it put us in that theta state, held us there without any effort on our part, and stepped us right back up again. And we both got out of those beds and looked at each other and said, wow, that really worked for me. Did it work for you? And we agreed that it did. And we were very excited about that. And for the next week and a half, while Bob was gone, what we did was try to optimize it. We tried different bass frequencies. We tried different waveforms. Besides the sine wave, we put in triangular waves and square waves and all kinds of other things. We tried different volumes and intensities. And so by the time Bob came back, we had what we thought was a pretty good sound, and it was very effective. We told Bob about it, and actually Bob, I think, was even more excited than we were. Because he had the bigger picture. I mean, we were just young guys in a lab, and he kind of saw where maybe this would go. So the next step was to determine whether or not it was just us. We weren't exactly normal anymore. We'd been doing this with Bob for a year and a half, and we were very sensitive in our consciousness. We knew how to get down and get in that theta state and get out of body and that sort of thing very routinely. So we weren't just the average person, but we had to know, would it affect the average person, or was it just us because of all the training we had had? So the next thing was to get people in there who were naive subjects, if you will. And Dennis and I brought our wives, and we brought our children, and we brought our friends and neighbors and anyone we could, and we didn't tell them anything. We just said, listen to this, and then describe what happens, what happens with your mind. Just listen to it. And Bob was doing the same thing. Everybody that passed through Whistlefield, and in those days, people were constantly passing through Whistlefield. Bob was like a hub of interest in the larger reality, and he would snatch all of them, get them up to the lab, and have them, listen to this and see what you think. Well, after a couple of months of trying this on naive subjects, we found that it affected everyone. Now, everyone didn't go out of body. It depends a whole lot on what you bring to it. Some people, as soon as you get down to that theta level, they would just lose consciousness, just snap, they were gone, and as soon as they stepped back out of it, snap, they were awake again, and they'd say, oh, I fell asleep. Well, they didn't really fall asleep. They weren't tired. They just lost consciousness. But it did affect everybody. So we knew we had something to pursue. And what we needed then was a real experiment, some people that we could run through the paces, naive subjects again. So Bob called up some of his friends and passed the word around. He had a technology that was effective in helping one go out of body. And he got overwhelmed with responses. He booked the Tuckahoe Motel, which was a little motel over on Route 250. At that time, it had already seen its heyday and was a little bit dilapidated, run down, little motel. I think it had maybe 20 units, just one rectangular building with 10 doors on either side. And he booked the whole motel, and we had then about 2 or 3 weeks to get ready for 20 people that we were going to be our lab rats, and we were going to run them through a program. Now, Bob wanted to know, what could this do? Where did this putting them in this state, what did it allow him to do? So his job was to produce the program. And he produced a program that had them, looking in envelopes, reading numbers, seeing pictures, remote viewing. We had targets laid out. They were healing. They were visiting relatives. They were doing just anything you could imagine, that he could think of. We just wanted to know what happened. These are people that probably had been doing some of this stuff anyway, but what difference would it make now that they were listening to the sound? So we had this seminar, and by that time, Nancy Lee had joined us, and Nancy Lee had come in probably about the last month or so of that. She just graduated from college, and she was the organizer. She organized this whole thing, got people's travel arrangements, picked them up at the airport, got all the logistics, the refreshments, everything. So she was the organizer. Bob was busy doing the program, and Dennis and Bill Yost and I were in Bill Yost's garage trying to build equipment so we could put sound for 2 people in 20 rooms and GSR on all of them so we could keep track of what it was going on with their bodies. And that was a rush. As the people started arriving, Dennis and I were still in the closets of the motel rooms, soldering wires. Nancy Lee was in a Twitter because, everything, of course, at the last minute happens all at the same time, and she was organizing it all. And Bob was probably the only one that, was serene, but he was putting the final touches on his program. Well, the people came, they got in their beds, they put on their headphones, and for 2 days, for the weekend, it was the most paranormal things that I'd ever seen happen, at one time. One of the things you had them do was shining their energy beams, light up in the sky, and we'd go outside and see if we could see the lights in the sky, And there were lights in the sky, and there were more paranormal experiences. There were, these people got out of body, they made contacts, they read things in the envelopes, they saw the pictures, and we had some very good hits that way. So it was just a phenomenal weekend. And about that time, I think Bob started to think, I think we've got something, and there's enough interest that perhaps we can develop this and it'll even pay for itself. Up to that time, Bob paid for everything. He built the lab. He paid for the equipment. He paid for the components that we put together. So it was all out of his pocket up to that point. And I think he was looking for a way to expand that so more people could get involved. So then we held a few more of these seminars at the Tuckahoe, since we had that building wired, and we decided to make use of it. And there were 3 or 4 more held there. And matter of fact, the next speaker, the first speaker this afternoon, Joseph Pierce, he came to one of those additional seminars. So you'll have somebody here that was there at the Tuckahoe. I remember Joe, because the way it worked is that Bob would come right in the morning, and he'd say hello to everybody and give them a little pep talk. Then he would leave it, and Dennis and Nancy Lee and I would run the program, and Bob would show back up at the end, just when everybody was done, and say, well, how'd everybody do, and talk, and have a little thing at the end. So I remember Joe very well. I think Joe was a little disappointed that he had to deal with a couple of 20-something-year-olds, and not Bob Monroe for the whole weekend. But in any case, that's the way it was run. Well, we found out pretty soon that 20 rooms wasn't enough, and then I put Dennis and Bill Yost and I back in the garage, building now a portable audio harness that could play to 30, I think, maybe 40 people. We started renting large conference rooms in hotels, taking all the furniture out. The hotel people wondered, what were we doing? The table went out, the chairs went out, everything, and we would have, it'd be a room like this room, and we'd have aisles, and then we'd have bodies laid out all over the floor. And every 2 or 3 feet there'd be another body laying out on the floor, and they all had to come with their own mats, and or if they didn't have a mat, they just laid on the floor. And we put this wiring harness down the middle of the aisles and peeled off the earphones and so on to everybody. And again, it was Dennis and Nancy Lee and Tom that ran the seminars, and Bob would come in at the beginning and he'd come in at the end. So we did this and ran a whole bunch of those. At that time, the demand kept growing. Pretty soon, it was we needed a way to do this off-site, not just here in the Charlottesville area, but off-site. Now, this new land hadn't happened yet. We weren't here where we are today. We were still at Whistlefield Farm, was the headquarters of all of this. And so we started to go on the road. We'd pack up that harness, and Nancy Lee and I would go off to California and do a seminar, and Nancy Lee and Dennis would go off to the Northeast and do a seminar. And so it went until Dennis and I, with full-time jobs and full-time families, and now being trainers besides on the road, was just more than we could stand. So at that point, Dennis and I started to kind of back out and look for replacements. And Bob took a little chance to kind of stop and rest and see what he was going to do next with it, because it was obvious he had something that was going to work. So shortly after then that Bob purchased this new land, a place where he could build a facility, and other people came in. Dennis and I kind of slipped out the back. Now, I was still on the board and still interfaced a little bit here, but then that was kind of the end of my tenure with it. But so that was the invention, if you will, of Hemi-Sync and of TMI. Those things came later. Bob patented that binaural beat sound as Hemi-Sync, and that was his name that he chose for it. And eventually, of course, the organization got changed a couple of times until finally it ended up as TMI over here on the new land. Okay, so that's it for the history lesson. That's where Hemi-Sync and TMI came from. Yeah.